Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another hour of Healthy Conclusions, where we try to give our listeners important information on nutrition, exercise, and holistic, alternative, and integrative medicine. My name is Bob Neugebauer, and I will be your host for this evening's show. Tonight's show is being brought to you by Altrua Health Share, which has been serving its members and their families since 1997 with their health care needs. Take a moment to visit their website at altruahealthshare.org or call 888-244-3839 and compare their health share plan to your current one. It could mean substantial savings to you and your family's health care costs. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Linda Isaacs from New York City. Dr. Isaacs received a bachelor's degree of science from the University of Kentucky and her medical degree from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine and is a board-certified internal medical doctor. She is co-author of the book The Trophoblast and Origins of Cancer with Dr. Nick Gonzalez. Dr. Isaacs worked with Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez for 20-plus years using a nutritional approach for treating patients diagnosed with cancer and other serious degenerative diseases. Dr. Gonzalez passed away in 2015, and Dr. Isaacs has continued his work using nutritional supplement protocols which include large doses of pancreatic enzymes. Healthy Conclusions considers Dr. Isaacs one of the premier pioneers in the alternative treatment of cancer and other degenerative diseases with enzymes and nutritional therapy. You can find her contact information on our website, healthyconclusions.com, under Cancer Clinics and Alternative Medicine. Good evening, Dr. Isaacs, and welcome to Healthy Conclusion. Is there anything else that you would like to add about yourself to our audience?
Well, I think you covered the bases pretty well there. I am board certified in internal medicine, but I do focus my practice on nutritional approaches, as you mentioned in the introduction.
Let's start off here. You're conventionally trained and board certified in the internal medicine end of the business. So how do you become interested in alternative approaches to cancer?
Well, I think that many doctors who have gone into more nutritionally oriented work, it turns out that they had a personal experience that made them go in that direction. In my case, my mother had been interested in nutrition well before I was, and so I had a little background knowledge that I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to until when I was in medical school. I met Dr. Nick Gonzalez, who was mentioned in the introduction that you gave for me. And Dr. Gonzalez was a former journalist who had he'd gotten interested in nutrition. He was doing his internal medicine internship when I met him. I was a medical student on the team. And I worked with him in that capacity for 6 weeks, during which time I learned about some research that he was doing into another practitioner named William Donald Kelly. Dr. Kelly treated people with a nutritional program, and what Nick was finding as he researched Kelly's results was that there were a tremendous number of people who had done extremely well who should have been dead long since. That got him obviously interested in doing the research he was engaged in. I learned about it from him, and I got interested. And here we are, 30 years later, and I'm still doing this work.
Could you tell us a little bit about the nutritional approach to cancer, such as individualized diet and supplement protocols?
Well, part of the approach that we use does involve the idea that not everybody needs the same type of diet. When it comes to cancer patients, they tend to fall into one of two groups. One group needs a more vegetarian type of diet. That's more typically what you hear about, if you dip your toe into the water of alternative treatment of cancer. And the diet that we recommend for the majority of cancer patients would include some eggs and fish and dairy. But for the most part, it focuses on a lot of different vegetables, whole grains, organic foods, juicing, that kind of thing. But we do believe that there are some patients with some types of cancer that need a lot more animal protein in their diet. red meat, chicken, all sorts of heavier animal protein. And for those patients, we would be recommending grass-fed animals, good quality, not animals that have been fed a lot of hormones or growth stimulants or antibiotics, but nonetheless a very different diet from the other group. So we do think that different people do need different things.
Have you been following the ketogenic diet with Dr. Seyfried and his book and some of the things that have come out now in Turkey using IPT, insulin potentiation therapy? And is your diet similar to that, or is it much different in terms of the way you approach the diet? I know in the ketogenic diet it is pretty much fats and medium-chain triglycerides, along with vegetables and some meat products, some protein.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's different variations on the ketogenic diet out there. It's not something that we've used historically, and with any kind of dietary protocol or any kind of protocol at all, for that matter, what a person is mainly interested in, at least from my point of view, is results. We have a long track record of having quite a number of people do extremely well using the methods that we use. So given that the ketogenic diet can be a bit of a challenge to actually implement for many people, I have not jumped on that bandwagon myself, so I can't really comment much beyond that. The alternative world is sometimes rather long on theory and short on data. I know that many people will follow a ketogenic diet thinking that they're going to, quote, starve, close quote, the cancer because they're not eating any form of carbohydrate. The trouble with that is that your body will use whatever stores it needs to maintain the blood glucose, and it's not really possible to get your blood sugar low enough to make any impact on the cancer. What the ketogenic diet, there may be some values to intermittent fasting, for example. That's something that I'm looking at a bit more lately. But the ketogenic diet per se is not something that we've really used.
With the many patients that come through your clinic or come to you for help, how do you determine what type of nutritional approach to use on a particular patient in terms of figuring out how or what would be the best way for them to respond to the different types of diets?
Well, with cancer patients, it does tend to fall into patterns based on the type of cancer that a person has. So, for example, the types of patients that would do better on the more vegetarian diet, although not completely vegetarian, again, I think some protein is needed, some animal protein. But the types of patients that would do well with that are the group that the kind of cancer is described as a carcinoma. And that would include breast cancer, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer. Really, the vast majority of cancer patients have a carcinoma. And those patients do tend to do best with a more vegetarian diet with some eggs, some dairy, some fish. The other group, the types that do better with the higher amounts of protein in the diet, we believe would be those who have lymphomas, leukemias, the cancers of the immune system. And we believe that the metabolism of those types of patients is really very different, and that they do better with a higher amount of protein in the diet. That would also include people, most of the time, people with sarcomas, people with melanoma. That's another one that tends to be an illness that comes about in people who need more protein in their diet.
I know that some doctors use a hair sample to determine what is best for a patient, and they do an analysis of it. Is that something that you do there?
Well, we do have a test that we use that's based on the results that a particular lab gets from hair. It's an experimental test and not something that I usually focus on all that much in terms of letting people know what we do, just because it's not absolutely critical that we use it. Again, just based on clinical impression, I can come up with something that matches what we get with the hair test 99 times out of 100.
So you're not looking for some kind of a genetic match when you're talking about the nutritional approach to a patient's health?
I think it's possible that there are genetic markers that may well turn out to predict what type of diet a patient would do well with. I think, though, that a lot of that work is still in its early stages, and so I'm holding off on implementing that in my own practice just yet.
I understand that you use coffee enemas in your detoxification routines. So where did you get the idea of using coffee enemas? Where did it come from, and what is the purpose?
Well, coffee enemas, for the vast majority of our patients, just make them feel better. They find that, with the protocol, what we believe happens is that, if cancer cells are broken down, it creates waste materials, and those waste materials can make people feel like they've got the flu. The coffee enemas really help people with those types of symptoms. The vast majority of our patients are astonished to discover it's their favorite part of the program because they feel well with them. In terms of where they come from, Dr. Kelly said that he got the idea from a compendium of medical therapies called the Merck Manual. The Merck Manual is according to their website, they're the longest existing continually published medical textbook. They started their publications in the late 1800s, and it turns out that coffee enemas were very widely used for many, many years, going back. The furthest back I found was 1850, and I'm sure that they were used before then. So they were pretty extensively used in the medical literature for a long, long time. For example, in post-operative care, I actually found a reference to a lecture given by one of the Mayo brothers who founded the Mayo Clinic, in which he said that coffee enemas were absolutely essential in post-operative care. So they've been around for a long time.
Just curious, when you're talking about detox, my wife had cancer, and she passed away recently, but one of the problems that we encountered was the amount of cancer that was being killed. It was being killed too fast. It would clog up the lymph system and some other areas of the body, and they had to be cleared out. Is this essentially what the enemas do, clear the body of these toxic agents from the cancer cells?
Well, that's what we believe, yes. And, I can certainly say that patients who, for whatever reason, decide they don't need to do them or shouldn't do them do wind up getting a lot of the symptoms that we would say are from tumor waste. So that's the goal with those. Another way in which detoxification plays into our recommendations is actually eating organic food, because organic food doesn't have the sprays and chemicals and pesticides that your body's got to process and get rid of. The body, in effect, in a cancer situation, and especially if you're approaching it from a nutritional point of view, is trying to do years' worth of repair and rebuilding in a very short period of time. And that can be a serious challenge. That's what the coffee enemas are for, is to help with that, with getting rid of those wastes.
Okay, we have to take a quick break here. We'll be back in a few minutes for your listening pleasure to Healthy Conclusions, brought to you by the AltruaHealthShare.org, with your host, Bob Neugebauer, on 580 KIDO. Welcome back to Healthy Conclusions on 580 KIDO. We're speaking with Dr. Linda Isaacs about nutritional protocols and pancreatic enzyme therapy, sponsored by AltruaHealthCare.org. So, Doctor, we're talking about detoxification and clearing toxins from the body, and you were talking about the use of organic food rather than regular food. How important is the nutritional aspect of eating organically to curing people who have cancer?
Well, I think for a program like ours, it is really critically important. Understandably, it's an extra expense, and patients sometimes decide to cut corners in that area, and it doesn't usually work out very well for them. It's very, very important. I think also it's important for patients to I don't know, come to terms. I think we live in a society now where people are not expecting to cook meals at home from scratch. I'm very different from how I grew up. I know my mother had me knowing how to cook a meal by the time I was in sixth grade. Now it seems like people almost expect to be able to just buy something and heat it up, but that's not very realistic with a program like what we recommend. Making food from scratch, first of all, it tastes better, but secondly, it's much better for you, and that's something I think that people need to think through approaching cancer with the methods that we use.
Well, I have to admit, I've gone on an organic diet for the last year and a half, and the one thing I do enjoy is going into the supermarket and finding nobody in the produce area. It makes shopping a lot easier.
I may make shopping easier, but it's certainly bad for the health of the country that you can say that. That's really kind of scary almost. I guess here in New York City, everything is so crowded that there's always somebody in every area of the supermarket, no matter when you go. But I wish, for the sake of America, that your shopping in the produce area was more crowded than it is.
Yeah, I know the chip aisle is always crowded. That's for sure. Conventional scientists believe pancreatic enzymes are only for digestion. So who figured out that they would also be effective in the treatment of cancers? And what is the theory behind how they work in the body? And I have read something about Dr. Kelly's theories, but what are yours and Dr. Gonzalez's?
Well, the idea that pancreatic enzymes could be effective against cancer actually goes back to a scientist named Dr. Beard. He was a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and he was at his peak of discussing this whole thing a little over 100 years ago. He was an embryologist by training, someone who studied the very early stages of development. And he noticed in the course of doing his work, looking at various tissues under the microscope, that the very early stages of the placenta, and the placenta is what connects a baby to the mother's body as the baby is developing inside the uterus, the early stages of the placenta, which are called the trophoblast, under the microscope look a lot like a cancer. Part of that is because the function of the trophoblast is to attach to the uterus, to work its way inward, to create a new blood supply, and to, in effect, fool the mother's body into believing that there's nothing to react to here, even though the trophoblast is genetically like the baby, whose genetic material is only half the mother's. But the trophoblast's job then is to create that connection. So it invades, it creates a new blood supply, and it fools the immune system. Cancer does all of those things as well. And what Beard saw was that the way they look under the microscope was very, very similar. But there's one big difference between cancer and the trophoblast, the early stage of the placenta. The cancer keeps going. The trophoblast stops. At a certain point in development, the trophoblast stops invading, matures into the placenta, and at the time of delivery, after the baby is born, the placenta neatly peels off, leaving everything intact, so another pregnancy can happen down the road. And so Beard thought that if he could determine what the signal was that made the trophoblast stop invading, he might actually find an answer to cancer while he was at it. What he found when he looked at a lot of different things about what was happening at that stage of development, he found that that's when the baby started making pancreatic enzymes. Now, this happens at around 2 months of development in a human, way before that baby's going to see a solid meal, or any kind of meal. I guess they're not seeing solids for even longer after birth. But regardless, the enzymes aren't needed for digestion at that point. But if they're used to help control the behavior of the trophoblast, it makes all kinds of sense that they would be made that early. And so Beard proposed that pancreatic enzymes were a possible solution to cancer way back in the early 1900s. various doctors tried to put his work into practice in patients, there was variable success. There were some remarkable cases, but not everybody did well. Beard felt that that was because the quality of the pancreatic enzymes that were available in that era were very hit and miss, I guess would be a good word. In other words, there were times that people would be using excellent quality enzymes and other times that the enzymes being used had deteriorated. Bear in mind that refrigeration was only available for big commercial enterprises at that time, so your typical doctor's office, if they were lucky, they had an ice box. They probably had nothing. And so these biologically active things in solution that these doctors were trying to administer might or might not be any good. So there was a lot of controversy about this subject at the time. And Beard's theories have never really been put into, been studied properly in the regular medical world. But various practitioners, including Dr. Kelly, who I mentioned before, and certainly ourselves, have used pancreatic enzymes against cancer, and there's some remarkable case histories out there. There's also some basic science support for this idea in the sense that it turns out that the molecular similarity of the trophoblast and of cancer cells is widely accepted at this point. And there are also receptors for pancreatic enzymes that can be found on the surface of both trophoblast cells and cancer cells. So I think basic science may actually prove Beard's theories one of these days. They're heading in that direction bit by bit. Every time I check the literature, there's a new article that supports what Beard had to say.
How did the enzymes actually affect the cancer cells? What's the process? I mean, there are receptors on the cancer cells for the enzymes, but how do they affect them?
Well, the thing is, I tend to be, being scientifically trained, I tend to be very careful about what I say. What I can tell you is that I'm sure that they do have an effect because I have people who are, alive years down the road that should have been dead long since, and I think that the enzymes had an effect. But exactly what's happening on a molecular level, I really don't know for sure. Our theory is that they can literally cause the cancer cell to die, to explode, in effect. But that would require a lot of basic science research that isn't going to happen anytime soon, I would say.
And that's because most people just don't want to see a theory like this come to life because it would be in competition with three other general theories that they have, which is surgery, chemo, and radiation. Or is it because they just don't want to bother with something that could be a long process?
Well, with anything, I think you have to look at where the money is, and I don't want to sound cynical with that. I mean, basic science research, for example, doing the nuts and bolts type of research that would be required to show what pancreatic enzymes are doing exactly costs a lot of money. And so researchers understandably do things that are more likely to get funded. Although some studies are being done, but it's a slow process because there's no pharmaceutical support for doing something like this because pancreatic enzymes can't be patented. So, a pharmaceutical company isn't going to put $1 billion into figuring out if something works, how it works, funding the big studies that would be necessary to prove it when they're not going to make any money off it. So that's just the reality of science. It costs money to do it. People have to pay their bills, and they do what is supported.
Do you know of any doctors that are using this particular type of therapy in the U.S. besides yourself?
Not that I know of. I guess what I'd say, there may well be people out there, but there's no one whose work I can definitely endorse because I don't know exactly who might be doing it.
So you're pretty much the clinic when it comes to pancreatic enzymes, I would presume.
That's what I think. Again, there are other people out there that claim to be doing something similar, but I haven't thoroughly researched them to know if they know if they're getting the kind of results that we've seen over the years here.
Okay, we have to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes. You're listening to Healthy Conclusions, brought to you by AltruaHealthShare.org. with your host, Bob Neugebauer, on 580 KIDO. Welcome back to Health Conclusions on 580 KIDO. We're speaking with Dr. Linda Isaacs about nutritional and pancreatic enzyme therapy, sponsored by altruahealthcare.org. So, Doctor, your program is primarily nutritional in its orientation. How does a patient's psychology and spiritual orientation fit into this type of treatment? And before you take a patient on, do you discuss these important aspects of their therapy?
Well, I think that a patient's emotional outlook makes a huge difference in terms of the treatment, partly because doing something like this does require that they make a decision every day to take care of themselves. And that can be a challenge for people for a lot of different reasons. Certainly if someone doesn't have a certain amount of optimism and faith, then they're not going to be motivated to actually make those decisions. For example, I talked earlier about eating organic food, about cooking at home a lot. And, sometimes if people are feeling down or upset or whatever, they want to just eat something easy and quick and maybe sweet or chocolatey or whatever. But if somebody's falling into that kind of pattern over and over, it's going to interfere with the efficacy of this kind of an approach. So I think that patients do have to recognize when there are issues that they need to deal with in some ways. I know that negativity and fear can have a direct physical effect on people, I believe. And so all of those things need to be addressed in some way. Different patients find different paths. So I don't tend to be prescriptive in terms of what I tell them to do, but I do tell them that it's pretty common to have spiritual or emotional issues come up with this kind of change in their life, and that figuring out how they plan to approach and deal with it is a part of healing.
Now, I've taken several courses on the spiritual healing part of the medical end of the business, and from most of the lectures that I've listened to, it's become a very important part in some of the more dire diseases, even the autoimmune diseases like MS or Parkinson's, which they just critically approved as an autoimmune disease. These can be very devastating diseases over time. But I would think that before you took a patient on, that would have to be part and parcel of their belief system that they were going to get well.
Well, I do think that if a patient is driven by fear, that is detrimental to the body's well-being, and I think partly because it turns on the fight or flight system in the body, which is really geared towards short-term survival. It's not geared toward long-term repair and rebuilding of the system. And so people that are fear-driven, that is a problem, whereas people that are driven more by either a sense of mission, people that just say that their feeling is that they're not done, so to speak, on this earth, or people that are motivated more by joy, that look around and find things to be happy about, even in the most dire of circumstances, that both of those types of motivations or outlooks on life are more positive and more helpful. And the trouble is, of course, that as a physician, it's easy for me to say that, but from a patient's point of view, their life has just been turned inside out. They've been handed a life-threatening diagnosis, and of course they're afraid. But they have to, or ideally they would, I guess I should say, work through that and come back to, a realization that there is a lot of positive, and that being stuck in fear isn't terribly helpful. I think ideally we'd all be thinking about these things when we're healthy, but unfortunately for many of us, it's not until we get sick that we think about how we're looking at life.
If I could regress just for a moment, you mentioned that Dr. Beard had done some work in terms of getting the pancreatic enzymes into a more refined format. What would you say about
the pancreatic enzymes that are available today? Because I know quite a few people who are using them and taking them for digestion purposes. Mm-hmm. And do they have other purposes, of course, besides the digestion end of it?
Well, there's different types of pancreas product or pancreatic enzymes that are available out there. The pharmaceutical brands are purified, and they are heavily processed. Sometimes I know the times that I've taken them in the past, sometimes I've actually felt like there was a chemical aftertaste to them. So that's one type of pancreatic enzyme. The enzymes, or the product that we use, because strictly speaking we don't call them enzymes, it's freeze-dried pancreas, which naturally has quite a lot of enzymatic material in it. But we prefer that because we think it also comes with a lot of different cofactors and things that are lost in the process of the purification of the pharmaceutical grade enzymes. Having said that, pancreas products can be helpful for digestion, certainly, but they can also be helpful for a wide variety of other types of problems, like, for instance, arthritis. There's some data that suggests it can be helpful with a lot of different arthritis problems, autoimmune problems, a host of different other things, actually.
Well, I have to confess, I've been on them for about a year and a half, and I have to tell you that my life itself and the way I feel is much healthier than I had ever before. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the change to organic eating and more exercise and revising some of my bad habits. But I do find that the use of them has given me a little bit better feeling about myself in terms of my body itself.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear it.
Well, maybe we'll have something new here for health people. Do you believe surgery, except for life and death situations, has a place in the treatment of cancer?
Well, I do, actually. I think that there are diagnoses that can be cured by surgery. For instance, early-stage colon cancer, early-stage breast cancer. There's no question that those illnesses can be cured by surgery. I've met, in the course of my training in regular internal medicine and in the course of my practice doing this kind of work, I've met people who had those kind of diagnoses, got the surgery, and didn't do anything else, and many years later were doing just fine. Also, you remember we talked about the load to the body that can develop as cancer is treated by various methods. Well, surgery removes that tumor mass, and I think that can be helpful to the body in terms of getting rid of whatever remaining cells are there. If the body doesn't have to deal with that large amount of necrotic debris, as whatever treatment they're using hopefully has an effect, I think that can be better for the system. So I do believe that surgery has a role.
Do you feel the same way about chemotherapy and radiation in terms of their effectiveness on cancer? Because many of the studies that I've read show a 5-year survival rate for chemotherapy of, less than 3%.
Well, I think that here is where patients need to do their research and listen carefully to what they're told. Chemotherapy can be highly effective for a very short list of cancers. So if somebody contacts my office with Hodgkin's lymphoma, for example, I'm going to tell them to get chemo because it works for Hodgkin's lymphoma. But for other types of illnesses, what it may give is a response. And response to a cancer patient can sound like it means cure, but it doesn't. It means shrinkage. It doesn't mean anything about long-term survival. Sometimes response doesn't even have an effect on survival because even those who respond, their disease then recurs and explodes, and they wind up passing away at the same time as the people that didn't get the treatment. So people have to ask a lot of questions about what exactly the treatment is expected to do. And like I said, unfortunately, I've encountered a lot of people that didn't quite hear what the oncologist was saying or didn't understand what the oncologist was saying. I think that most oncologists mean well. I think that they're doing what they think is best. But patients will frequently think that something's going to cure them when it won't.
We're going to have to take another quick break here. We'll be back in a few minutes, folks. You're listening to Health Conclusions, brought to you by alchuahealthshare.org, with your host, Bob Nuckelbauer, on 580 KIDO. Welcome back to Health Conclusions on 580 KIDO. We're speaking with Dr. Linda Isaacs about nutritional and pancreatic enzyme therapy, sponsored by alchuahealthshare.org. So, Doctor, on with some of the questions here. Patients always ask about success rates, I'm sure, but instead you focus on case reports. Why is that?
The trouble with success rates is that success rates in the medical literature are really based on formal studies. In other words, if you go to your oncologist and they quote you a set of statistics about the results that can be gotten with some particular agent, what they're quoting is not based on their own personal experience in their own office. It's based on the results of a study, a formal study, that is set up to minimize the amount of variation from patient to patient. In a clinical practice, you see a lot of different types of patients, and characteristics of the illness may be different from one person to the next. The other huge wild card with anything like the treatment that we offer is whether or not the patients actually follow through with it. The huge issue, compliance. Do they actually swallow their pills? Do they actually do it in the way that that we feel is what's needed to have an effect? And people don't always do it properly. Also, there can be different amounts of previous treatment they've had, a lot of different variables. And so the net result is that we can't generate from a private practice the kind of data that would be persuasive to another doctor. And so given that that's the case, given that that's not the way that medical information is generated, we don't have formal statistics for any particular type of illness. What we do have is case reports. Case reports from my point of view demonstrate what's possible, but I can't prove that that's going to be the outcome for any individual patient.
So when I see a doctor or a specific clinic that comes up and says, well, we've had 1,000 cases over the past 6 years, and 70% of those are still living, I should kind of take a real close look at that?
It's really hard to say. There's an article that Dr. Gonzalez and I wrote on this topic a few years back that's freely available as a link from my website. It goes into a little more detail about this. But, typically statistics would be done by, this kind of claim would be done by comparing to a population as a whole. As an example, one that some of the major centers will use as a comparison to how cancer patients across the U.S. have done based on what's called the SEER database. The trouble is that automatically any population that goes to a major medical center is going to do better than the overall average, simply because the overall average includes people that are too sick to go see another doctor. I mean, they're, for instance, using pancreatic cancer as an example. There are some people that are so sick when they're diagnosed that they get the news on Tuesday and they're gone by Friday. I mean, those people never went to the major medical center, but they're included in the statistics nationwide. And so it's not too difficult to jimmy statistics to make yourself look good. There's been some articles about that, and some of the news media about some of the claims that some of the medical centers make. You have to be careful, is what I'd say, in listening to that kind of information.
Could you share some of your notable case histories with our audience?
Sure. One case that I always enjoy talking about, just because it's fairly straightforward, and this patient continues to do well to this day. This is a woman, a patient of mine, who came in to see me in early 2001. In the fall of the year 2000, she was losing weight and she had a little bit of abdominal pain. She went to see her doctor, and credit to her doctor, the doctor immediately sent her for a CAT scan, which showed a 3.4 centimeter mass in her pancreas. Now, she then had a biopsy a little over a month later, which showed that she definitely had adenocarcinoma. And there are different types of pancreatic cancer. She had what was confirmed to be the nastiest type, adenocarcinoma of the ducts, the glands that make enzymes, and that the slides were actually sent to an outside facility to confirm this bad diagnosis. Now, she was told that her disease could be treated by surgery, and I mentioned earlier that surgery can be very useful for cancer patients, but in her case, she did her research and decided not to get it. Pancreatic cancer surgery can be very debilitating, just the effect of the surgery itself, and most of the time it actually does not give you long-term good results. Most of the time the cancer recurs, even if the doctor thought they got it all, just because it had already spread locally. So she did her research, she decided not to get it, and she wound up coming to see me in March of 2001. She went on her program, and she's continued on it to this day. She never got the surgery. She never got chemo. She never got radiation. She's just been doing this program, and she is still alive to this day. And I spoke with her, I think, about 6 weeks ago. She was doing fine at that time, just had a few questions about some tests another doctor had done. But she's doing well. And this is a disease that the natural history of this would be that she should have been dead a long time ago. I mean, she is now 16 years out. 16 months would have been remarkable. But she's still alive and enjoying her life all these years later.
So a lot of your therapy has to do with how the patient reacts, how well they do the therapy that you give them to get the kind of results that somebody like this would have. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if she had, first of all, if she'd been consumed with worry or fear, that would not have been helpful. She's actually a very faithful woman who wound up teaching little classes on nutrition with her church group. So she's a woman of very strong faith. She is somebody who follows the diet very rigorously. She took her supplements. She did her coffee enema. She did what she needed to do. She thought it through, researched our treatment, decided it was something she wanted to do and she could do, and she did it. Very straightforward, and she's been a wonderful source of support to me over the years. She's the kind of patient that when she leaves the office, I feel better, and that's always a real joy to have, to work with.
Well, it's nice to see that somebody who is a regular MD is moving towards the more alternative end of the medicine field. And I see that happening more out here also with many of the medical doctors who are looking more into the holistic and alternative way of doing things. I want to thank you for joining us this evening and for your enlightenment on nutritional and pancreatic enzyme therapy. If you'd like to contact Dr. Isaacs, you can find her listed on our website at healthyconclusions.com under Cancer Clinic/Alternative Medicine. This is Bob Neugebauer signing off for Healthy Conclusions. We hope you will join us again at the same time next Sunday for another hour of informative talk about nutrition, exercise, and alternative medicine options, sponsored by AltruaHealthShare.org on 580 KIDO.